Good to see a lot of familiar faces in the room, and go Utes, by the way. Go Utes. I know I'm in the wrong county to say that, but that's okay. Right, Jim? I mean, it's okay. You say it anywhere we go. So thanks for having me. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, but I also think that the term innovation is one that is really confusing. And so for the next maybe 15 minutes or so, I have the privilege of being able to share my view on this, and a lot of what we've worked on at Intermountain, and a number of my colleagues have been involved with this. They're here in the room. So a little bit of a quiz. Can anyone tell me what the first number is? Not what it equals. What does it represent? Any guesses? Okay, if you Google the term innovation, this is the number that it gives you. 601 million references to innovation. So if you're confused, it's understandable. And so I decided to do a little bit of fun math, since analytics is kind of the buzzword in healthcare. If you clicked on each of these links, one per second, it would take you 20 years to get through all of them. Yeah, 31 million seconds in a year for those number geeks in the room. Okay, so what's the second number? Seems easier, but it's not. If you go on to Amazon and type in innovation filter to books, there are 73,006 titles on innovation. So now you think about the other number. If you read one book a day, how many years would it take you to read all the books on innovation? Assuming these are unique references, it would take you 20 years. 20 years. And so this word, I almost think it has become a nebulous term, actually, is that we don't know what it means often, and we haven't defined what it represents. And so I think one of the struggles that we have is doing that very thing in healthcare. If you were to ask for all the definitions of innovation in the room, you would get multiple ones, and you would all be right. Because whatever your definition of it is applicable to your organization, and I think that works. And so there are really four types of innovation. A guy named Clayton, who some of you may know, says there are four types. There's disruptive, which is the topic of the panel. And then there's sustaining innovation, which is just doing what you do better. He has what he calls efficiency innovation, and that's just finding better ways to do things. I like to reference it in a different way, and I'll share that in a minute. And then on the fourth one, he says you have new market innovation. I like to replace new market innovation with business model innovation, because I'm not a believer that there are new markets. I believe they already exist. It's just new business models tap them. And so it's really easy. So my definition of innovation is taking an idea to a meaningful or measurable outcome for someone who has a job to be done. And if you know of Clayton's theory, that's my definition of it, because I think sometimes we get too caught up in trying to determine what the innovation is a priori. You can't know beforehand what it's going to be. If we knew how to predict disruptive innovation, then we would all be doing it constantly, and we would never fail. So don't worry if you're failing. It's actually part of the nature, and we'll talk about that too. But that's a really interesting way to look at innovation, I think, because it's really confusing and it's really hard. But you wonder, why do we keep getting it wrong? I worked for a couple of really big software vendors before coming to Intermountain Healthcare. And I remember we did a big launch of a software, and it really failed. And we had been working on it for about 2 years, and it went through the whole bit of requirements, and then it went through the whole thing of building it, and then we went through QA, and then we went through final integration QA. And when we tried to deploy it at a hospital, it was DOA. Really didn't quite work out too well. We had a bunch of frustrated doctors, and it really bothered me. One, because the hospital was spending money, and two, because the people who had worked so hard on it felt like they had failed. So I thought, okay, what happened? And this is what I think happened. And this is what I call the 3 C's of design disease. And maybe that's not the appropriate way to think about it, but that's the way I think about it, is today when we're trying to understand where to innovate, where do we spend most of our time? In a conference room, in our cube, or on a conference call? And guess what? That doesn't work. If you haven't noticed, it doesn't work. And maybe I'm kind of getting the Master of the Obvious award today, but I'll tell you why I think it doesn't work. Is because if you don't understand the circumstances where people are trying to make progress, I don't know how you design something that they would love to use. It's the fourth word called circumstance or context. It's however you want to choose to do it. And so I think conference rooms are really good for starting to do some brainstorming. And they're really good for coming up with what you believe to be true. But the only thing a conference room is really good at designing is for a conference room. So if you're building conference room things, it's really good to observe in a conference room. If you're building it for somewhere else, it's probably your conference room is a good start, but it's not good enough. And then we've got this next thing, kind of cube brilliance. We're all so brilliantly smart in our cubes. We really are. No offense, but we're really smart in our cubes. And I get to work with a lot of startups, and my colleague Lonnie Northup and I see, I don't know how many hundreds of them we've seen in the last 12 months, but it's unbelievable. And a lot of times their great ideas start in a cube like this, and they believe that we'll be able to absorb it in a system, and it just works. Again, interesting place to start a design. And then this last one, conference calls. We're all really good at conference calls, but if you look at the research on conference calls, about 70% of people multitask during a conference call. And if that's not wrong, no number is. Every one of us multitasks during a conference call, right? And so we're distracted, which means we're not really getting it. And in my opinion, if we're building a piece of software or a device for someone, the best thing we can do in the world is to get into their context and watch what they do. Margaret Mead was one of the great creators of kind of this notion of contextual inquiry or ethnography. And she said, what people say and what people do is not what they say they do. And so we've got this notion of getting requirements based on what people say they do, but that's not the way the brain works. And if you have read Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, he talks about two parts of our brain. One is our habit part. It's called System 1. And everything we do, we try to make a habit out of it because our brain doesn't want to be tired all the time, because System 2 is your thinking part. It's where you have to intellectually engage. It's what I call the think flow part of the brain. We'll talk about that in a minute. And so we've been struggling with this for a long time. I have been since 2008. And even at Intermountain, we've built software before when we're building our own and would deploy it and make a mistake, and that's inside of our own system. Think, how do we make that mistake, or how do we fix it? And so this is one of my favorite quotes from Da Vinci. I haven't memorized this one. But he really says it well when he says, the eye, the window of the soul, is the chief means why by the understanding can most fully and abundantly appreciate the infinite works of nature, and the ear is second. I change it a little bit. The infinite complexity of healthcare delivery is what I put there for us. Because unless you have observed in an OR or in a GP's office or in a GI lab or during a C-section or whatever the setting is, it's very, very difficult for you to understand what's happening, and it makes it even more difficult then for you to design something for them. When we talk about satisfying a customer, I use this acronym called RED, Required, Expected, Desired, and Delighters. And we do requirements, and I think that's like the low level. So I always wonder why we do requirements documents and not delighter documents. What if we were to change our frame of thinking and say, okay, we're going to do delighter documents? Well, how do you get to the delight stage? I would argue that you have to go into the context of care or the setting. You've got to go in someone's home. You've got to ride with the home care nurse. You have to shadow nurses and watch them for weeks, I think, to really understand, even to design a building or to design software. So about 4 years ago, we started on this path at Intermountain to create a program that we now call Design for People. And we teach people how to go in and observe. And then we teach them how to observe themselves and other teams. And it's in its infancy stage, but what we've learned so far from going out and doing that is that the assumptions that we had in those 3 C's were never completely accurate. And so we're trying to do this because the more accurate you get your early understanding, the fewer mistakes you make later, and the better fiduciary responsibility you show to the money that people pay you to take care of them. So that's it. Use your eyes and go see. So this is an interesting one. I love this one from Adrienne. She says, no one sleeps in this room without the dream of a common language. There is a common language in healthcare. I call them language objects. If you go into the doctor, if Jacob goes into the doctor and says, hey, I'm in a lot of pain, the doctor will actually ask him, how much pain are you in? So we've got probably 50 to 70 language objects in medicine that helps us understand someone very, very quickly. The problem, and the other problem for me in innovation, is we don't have a common language. 601 million references, 73,000 books. And so in struggling with this too at Intermountain, we thought, okay, how do we figure out how to make sense of this frenetic world of innovation, and what do we do? And how do we create a language that binds us to the operators? Because all the operators in the room see the innovators as a three-headed monster who's taxing my money to put it at risk. When I was at GE, that was one of our biggest struggles, and so we put together a program called FastWorks. Well, at Intermountain, we've thought about this notion, and I'll go quickly through this, of an innovation process model. And within our system, and I think most systems, you call them clinical pathways or clinical process models, or you call them policies, procedures. There's all these different ways to refer to the way we do things. And the root of it is a scientific method, really. We want a method to know whether or not our assumptions are right, and we want to be more predictable and more accurate. I think it's why we're seeing so much growth in AI and all the other things, is it's so that we reduce the amount of mistakes we make. And it's kind of my passion to do this in innovation too, so create this notion of an innovation process model. And for me, it has 4 parts. And we continue to test and try to refine this at Intermountain, but the first one I think you have to have is a theory. So if you think about the impact that Pasteur had, what did he create? He created the notion of a germ theory. And from the germ theory, we've seen so much research around meds and what have you, and it's helped populations live a lot longer. So in the innovation, the theory that I use is Clayton's theory of the job to be done. You can read about it in Competing Against Luck. But he basically says people have a job to do. And a job is the progress that they're trying to make in a particular circumstance. The circumstance is the key word. It's absolutely the key word. And I was with Clayton a few weeks ago in Boston, and we kept going back to the fact that unless you get into the context of care and observe, or the context of where you think you're innovating for, you're really missing it, because the circumstance is key. A lot of you probably know his milkshake story, and there are a lot of other ones. But there are 3 dimensions to the theory. There's the functional job, and that's just the task that you're trying to do or the problem you're trying to solve. And then there's the emotional dimension, and that is how do I feel when I'm doing the job. And then there's the social dimension of how do I want to be perceived. And so for the doctors in the room and the nurses in the room, when we design a room that causes you to put your back to your patient, we've missed the emotional dimension of you connecting with your patient and the social dimension of you being perceived as someone who thinks the computer is more important than the patient, right? And it's because we often have designed these rooms around the functional need of pulling cables and putting wires and beds and what have you, but I think we can do both. I don't think this is an and or. The second part I think you need is the right mindset. And for me, the heart of healthcare, just the heartbeat of it, is empathy. I think that's why it exists. I think that's why we work so hard. And I think it's really difficult to be empathetic in a conference room or on a conference call or in your cube, because you don't understand the essence of what we struggle with inside the hospital. I had the fortune yesterday of being in a hospital, up at Primary Children's Hospital. Walking those halls is unbelievable. It changes. I'm not a clinician, but it changes the way you think about the people, the families that we serve, the nurses, the docs. It really puts a different kind of viewpoint on why you should innovate and how. So empathy is the key, and then the next one's curiosity. People argue that they don't think medicine is that curious, and I argue that it's the most curious thing in the world, because we're always writing papers, we're questioning why, we're trying to do things better. But I think you have to have a theory to help understand causal things, and then I think you have to have a mindset, and then I think you have to have a tool set to do it. You have to. And the tool set that I like to use are a couple of tools from a guy named Alex Osterwalder. He wrote the book Business Model Generation and Value Proposition Design, and it's a way of taking Clayton's jobs theory with the value proposition canvas and putting it on paper and making people go through kind of a scientific method of saying you've got an assumption that you think your innovation is solving a problem. Now design an experiment, run a test, and go get insights. And you'll validate it or invalidate it. But it's a tool set that creates this common language. It's a language object. And so if you're an operator, you can push your innovators to use these tools so that you have a common language of knowing when you need to invest. So it really works. And then there's the last one, and just at the close of my remarks, around a skill set. And I actually believe that innovators have to have a skill set. And I was in Houston about a year ago, and someone asked me, it was a really intriguing question, I thought it was, said, what is the ultimate skill needed by an innovator? What do you guys think it is? Okay. What else?
Critical thinking.
Okay. What else?
Persistence.
Oh, yeah, they got to be stubborn as all get out.
Communication.
Okay.
Curiosity.
Okay.
Persistence.
Persistence, yeah. Oh, yeah, you got to have, yeah. Especially if you want to be an entrepreneur. You got to be a little bit off. But it's worth it because you're trying to make an impact in the world. My answer to it is you have to know how to ask questions. You really have to be curious, and you need to know how to ask questions. And you need to know how to ask questions that get you to a very uncomfortable spot. It's really research. It's verbal research because you're wanting to dig and interrogate and understand. The other skill I think you have to have, but before I get to the rest of them, there's a great example of Skillsets. You guys know who this guy is? Yeah. Okay, and for those of you who didn't laugh, raise your hand. It's just you don't want to admit it. But this is kind of a fun movie in my home when we just want kind of just downtime with our brains. We like to watch Napoleon, and then there's another one. I forget what it is. Jack Black's in it. Yeah, Nacho Libre. My kids quote that all the time, and when they're quoting it a lot, I can tell they're having stress at school or on the ball field because it's their way of just checking out. And so I think that he may have a couple of suggestions of the skills that we need. Let's hope this works.
Nobody's gonna go out with me.
Have you asked anybody yet?
No, but who would? I don't even have any good skills.
What do you mean?
You know, like nunchuck skills, bow hunting skills, computer hacking skills. Girls only want boyfriends who have great skills.
So I just love that movie, by the way. It probably says a lot about my personality. But I think that a lot of us assume that you have to be born an innovator, or that you have to be born an entrepreneur to be an innovator, and I don't agree with that. I actually think it's a developed skill that you can get because all of us know how to ask a question. The other skill I think you need to know how to do is to write a hypothesis. How do you go through the scientific method of things that you believe to be true? And then the third thing I think is you need to know how to observe. You need to know how to get out of the office. We talk about that a lot in the lab. Get out of the office. You believe that's right, but get out of the office, which means go into the context and observe. And I think those are really, all the ones you mentioned are there too. But those, for me, are the real heart of getting this innovation thing right. And I'll close with this. I think there's one other thing you need to know how to really do, and that's to know how to measure something. Now, there's a little bit of a twist on it. We are measured to death in healthcare. And I'm not saying it's good or bad. But I think a lot of our measures miss the heart of why we need to innovate. And so in Clayton's terms, people hire a solution to do something. Like I hire a watch. Well, if you think about 20, 30 years ago, some of you in the room don't know that number, but 20 or 30 years ago, we hired a watch so we would know what time it is. It was a functional hire. Today, if you look at it, a lot of our watches are social hires. They give us status. They look really good, right? And they kind of look cool on the arm, and we never look at them. We always just look at our phones because we're checking that thing every 15 seconds anyway. And so there's another notion to think about in this whole idea of a skill set, and that is, what do you measure? And I think we need to get to this notion of a customer benefit metric, or what a buddy of mine and I have kind of coined called a love metric. And yeah, I know it sounds a little funny. I cracked somebody up over there. But if someone's going to use your system or your innovation, what would they love for it to help them do? So when we're designing a piece of software for a doctor or for a nurse or an APC or even for a person in their home, what are they going to hire it to help them do? Because by the way, people don't hire healthcare systems for health. They hire healthcare systems to help me get back to work, help me get my kids back to school. And so if they're going to hire it, what would they love for it to help them do? Would they love for it to help them spend 3 more minutes with a patient versus being inside of a system and typing? And when we get to the point to where we understand their jobs to be done based on the theory, then we can start adding to our corporate measures that most people don't care about unless they're financial people or own a P&L. How do we add to it the things that people who are using our solutions really, truly care about? And if we can get to that, I would argue that if we get to that, we'll start innovating in the right way. Because if you can get to the heart of the love metric or the customer benefit metric by doing observations and having a theoretical framework around it like the jobs theory, and you got the right mindset, empathy and curiosity, I think, is at the heart of what we do, and you have a tool set, then I think all of a sudden this nebulous, frenetic world of innovation becomes much more predictable. We stop making so many design mistakes and deploy mistakes, and we stop wasting money on it. But this is kind of the journey that we're going through at Intermountain Healthcare in trying to make much more predictable sense of innovation in healthcare, whether it's disruptive or whether it's not disruptive. And so I hope that's been helpful. Thank you.